Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to Brookings Doha Center's very timely event on Afghanistan. My name is Aisha Tanzim. I'm a journalist working for Voice of America. I cover both Afghanistan and Pakistan for them. But obviously, whatever I say here has nothing to do with VOA policy. Let me start with some housekeeping issues. I'm sure all of you carry this pesky device. Please turn it to silent. If you think you've already done it, please check one more time, because nothing messes up a good conversation than that ringtone. And then to the real stuff. Today, the United States and Taliban started their next round of discussions. I think it's the 6th time they're meeting, in this very city not far from where you sit. To give you a sense of how serious these discussions are getting, the last time they met, that round lasted for 16 days straight. So these negotiations are proceeding. Both sides have reached 2 agreements in principle, and they've both announced it. First is the foreign troops will withdraw from Afghanistan, and the second is that Afghan soil will not be used for terrorism against any other country. So it sounds great. But it also sounds to me a little bit like world peace, where everybody wants it, but nobody really knows how to get there. So we're hoping that our very esteemed panel here will help us negotiate that labyrinth and answer some of those questions. Our very first guest for the evening is Dr. Barnett Rubin. He's a celebrity in the circles who watch Afghanistan, and his biography reads like a book. So I'm going to do what journalists these days get paid to do, which is take very long, complicated, nuanced stories and reproduce them in 280 characters.
I wish I got paid for that.
So, bullet points. Dr. Rubin, right now and for almost 2 decades, has been associated with the New York University's Center on International Cooperation. He's the associate director there. He directs the Afghanistan-Pakistan program there. He has been a senior advisor to both the US and the UN on Afghanistan, their special representatives. He has also advised the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, UNAMA. He's advised them at very crucial times, like when the Bonn Agreement was being negotiated and when the Afghan Constitution was being drafted. He's worked extensively on documenting human rights violations in Afghanistan. He's written a ton of books on the country. His articles on the region and on US foreign policy regularly appear in top-notch publications, including but not limited to Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Washington Post, etc., etc. And to top it all off, he's also the winner of MasterChef Afghanistan. No, I'm sorry, I made that up. I totally made that up. That's not true. But you never know, the guy's unstoppable. MasterChef Afghanistan.
MasterChef, oh, okay.
Would you consider that?
Yes, definitely. I think I have a chance.
See, the guy knows everything about Afghanistan. Sitting next to him is Graham Smith. He's a Canadian author, researcher, and award-winning journalist, and now a consultant with the International Crisis Group. He has also worked for UNAMA and authored a best-selling book on the war in Afghanistan. He won an Emmy Award for his multimedia series, Talking to Taliban, in which 42 Taliban fighters discussed why they fought. So that would be very interesting to talk about. And our third guest is Ajmal Pashtunyar, an Afghan-Canadian lawyer. He's worked with both the Canadian government and with the International Criminal Court on traditional justice and reconciliation issues in Afghanistan. He has also examined models of justice and truth-seeking, not just in Afghanistan, but also in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Rwanda, and Sierra Leone. He is himself a former Afghan refugee who grew up in Peshawar. Our speakers will start with opening remarks of 10 minutes each, followed by a discussion and a question-answer session. So let's get on with it. Dr. Rubin, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Aisha, for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be.
شكرا جزيلا لهذه المقدمة. أشكرك على هذه المقدمة. لا أستطيع أن لا أعرف أجمل، لكن التقيت بوالدي في بيشاور قبل زمن طويل عندما كنت أزور تلك المنطقة كجزء من بحوثي، وإنني أقدر تماما مركز بروكينغز الدوحة لدعوتي هنا، وهذه فرصة لي لأكون في الدوحة في هذه الأوقات المهمة. أود أن أشير إلى شيء قالته عائشة حول أن إنهاء هذه الحرب هل هي أمر صعب بصعوبة تحقيق السلم في العالم. لا أعرف إن كان هذا صحيحا، لكن أود أن أقول أننا غالبا ما نسيء التعبير عن ما هو الهدف الجهود صنع السلام وما ينبغي أن تكون عليه على الأقل. فبالإفراط في التبليغ على المقاتلين ودوافع قتالهم ومفاوضاتهم، وبالتالي فمثلا في الوقت الحالي الولايات المتحدة
Taliban are having meetings in Doha in which the agenda is, and these items are not completely agreed as I understand, the withdrawal of foreign troops from Afghanistan, counterterrorism guarantees, not just in general, but specifically about specific named groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS or Daesh, ETIM, and so on. And the relationship of an agreement on those issues, which are the core issues for the United States and the Taliban, and a political process within Afghanistan in order to settle the political disputes over the governance of Afghanistan so that as to address the internal elements of the conflict as well. But it's possible that if we settled, right now there's a war which, very roughly speaking, to put it in 280 character style, is between the United States, NATO, and the Afghan government on the one side, the Taliban and a few allied groups on the other side. But if we only end that war, we might end up with just another war. Because remember, the war did not start in 2001. Or let's say war in Afghanistan did not start in 2001. It started in 1978 and 1979. And it's very interesting to bear in mind that the war started when a party inspired by an ideology that now has no effective presence, Marxism-Leninism, took over the country in a coup and was then supported by intervention by a country that no longer exists. And the war was defined as a struggle against communism and the Soviet Union. And then communism and the Soviet Union disappeared, but the war continued. That's a very important lesson. It means there are fundamental causes of this war that were not about the motivations of the combatants and what they said about what they were doing and why they were fighting. Then you had another period of the war where, in many respects, it appeared to be a war about nothing. You know, a war where different factions were competing for power with the help of various regional powers, and they articulated religious ideologies, ethnic ideologies, different sorts. Finally, the Taliban, with the support of Pakistan, almost brought that to a conclusion. And then, because international terrorist organizations, but specifically Al-Qaeda, which had established itself first in Pakistan and then in Afghanistan in the late 1980s and early 1990s, when expelled from Sudan, reestablished itself in Afghanistan and launched the attack on the United States. While it was living on territory which was controlled, but apparently not very completely, by the Taliban, or as they called themselves, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. So now there's a war about that. But so if we end that war, just as likely we'll get another war. And I won't speculate about what those will be about. But so let me step back a little and let me give you certain fundamental facts about, not just about Afghanistan, but about this region and the world. First of all, Afghanistan is the poorest country in Asia, by far. In fact, it is the poorest country in the world, except for a handful of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, who also have been victims of years and years of war. until very recently, it was poorer than Haiti, the island of Haiti in the Caribbean. That's very significant because, after all, war is expensive. And Afghanistan, if Afghanistan is supposed to be the fulcrum or focal point of this war on terror, can a country that is that poor really sustain that kind of function? That's one thing. Now, that doesn't just mean the people are poor and we should feel sorry for them because sometimes, no. It means this territory, which, of course, the people living on it are inheritors of great civilizations and cultures, great ancient empires of different sorts. But the particular state called Afghanistan, within its current borders, which built on all of those heritages, was created by the British and Russian empires in the late 19th century and demarcated in such a way as to be dependent on the British Empire and isolated from international politics in order to act as a buffer state and stabilize imperial competition in the region. So the external dependence of Afghanistan is not just a random fact or an accident. As we say nowadays, it is not a bug, it is a feature. It was designed into the state as it now exists, that it must have international support in order to sustain itself, because of the territories that were removed from the control of the King of Kabul at those times and so on, which is a dispute that is still with us today. Now, there was a great power agreement in the late 19th century, and over time it transformed, but there was a modus vivendi which developed out of that between the two sides in the Cold War, which roughly meant, geographically it was very similar. The Soviet Union on one side, where the Russian Empire had been, the US allied with Pakistan on the other side, where British India had been, although British India was now partitioned, which was quite significant. But that broke down. You're giving me that my time is up.
Yes, I'm watching it.
Yes, okay. Now, what happened is there was a great power agreement on how to subsidize the state until '78, so it avoided clashes. Since then, there has no such agreement. It broke down. Then the Soviet Union controlled the state, which was a threat to others. The United States came in with its Pakistani, Chinese, Saudi allies, supported the Mujahideen, which meant there was no longer a single entity that had monopolized legitimate violence in Afghanistan. Then when the Soviet Union collapsed, the support for that state collapsed, and the state collapsed, and you had a very anarchic situation. The Taliban came in and tried to bring some order through Sharia and the assistance that they received from Pakistan and others internationally, but they could not attain international legitimacy and support because of the presence of Al-Qaeda there, various other policies that they had at the time. And then the attacks of 9/11 meant that the United States went in. Now that the United States-led coalition had broad international support originally as fighting against terrorism, but the longer the United States stayed there and appeared to be not succeeding in fighting terrorism, and two, pursuing other goals, the more the countries that had supported it in the region began to think that there were two threats in Afghanistan. One was terrorism, and the other is the United States. So now, briefly, the problem now for ending not just the current stage of the war, but the war, is not only do we have to resolve the dispute that grew up between the United States and Taliban over the troops, terrorism, and so on, the many disputes among Afghans that have developed in the last several years, in the last decades, over how the country is to be run, what is the relationship of the different groups inside the country, Afghanistan's disputes with its immediate neighbors, especially with Pakistan, over many issues. But also, eventually, the country will have to be stabilized with foreign aid, and if it's not done in such a way, at least until such time as it's self-sufficient, it has to be done in a way that does not provoke or threaten any powers with the capacity to just disrupt it.
That is such a wonderful place to cut you off.
Can I just add one sentence?
Please.
And that is why we're focused on these negotiations that are taking place in Doha here. We're here in Doha. But last week, there was a meeting between the special representatives of the United States, Russia, and China in Moscow, which led to the issuance of a consensus statement by Russia, China, and the United States about conditions for a settlement in Afghanistan. So that is the start of the creation of a great power and also mediocre power consensus, we hope, as part of the peace process, which is essential for its being sustained.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rubin. Now, Graham, the floor is yours.
I'm happy you didn't name names about which power was great, which power is mediocre.
And what about the third one? There were three powers there.
I wasn't referring to those two. Mm-hmm. No, it's a great honor to share a stage with Dr. Rubin and Ajmal. I'm not on? I'm not connected? Test 1, 2, 3. There we go. I mean, Dr. Rubin has been following Afghanistan for about as long as I've been alive, so I certainly won't be contesting anything that he has to say, especially because pretty much everything he's been saying publicly recently about peace is all stuff that I agree with. I would say that, you know, Dr. Rubin, you've been following the ups and downs of Afghanistan throughout the decades, and I've only been seeing downs in my time. I've been following Afghanistan since 2005. I lived in the south of Afghanistan for a few years, and then I lived in Kabul. And as a conflict analyst, as someone who gets paid to predict what's going to happen next, my job has been very, very easy, unfortunately, because every year the violence has gotten worse and worse and worse. The conflict has continued to grow. More people have died with every single year. So in most years in Afghanistan, over the last dozen years or so, when someone asked you what's likely to happen next, you could say, well, there's probably going to be 20 to 30% more violence next year, and the Taliban will have a little bit more territory. And you'd be right. It was an easy prediction to make, unfortunately. You know, now, today, Afghanistan is the largest war in the world, according to the number of battle deaths. It's more deadly than Yemen and Syria combined, by far, you know. So it really does feel like we've reached a sort of inflection point in the carnage, that something has to change, because the cost of not changing something rises daily. You know, in the last 30 days or so, the palace in Kabul believes that they lost 1,100 Afghan members of the security forces. That number might be a bit low, but that's what they believe. You know, this is not a stalemate. Anyone who tells you the situation in Afghanistan is some sort of a balance between the two major sides, between the Taliban and the government forces, those people are lying to you. The situation is eroding. Just this week, the US military decided to stop measuring how much territory is controlled by the government because it was getting embarrassing. And so when I talk to my friends in Kabul and they say, oh, why should we negotiate? You know, the Taliban are not nice guys. I say, I don't care if you think the Taliban are nice guys or not. You need to negotiate, because there's a risk that the situation will collapse. Now, the more difficult question is, when you're talking to the Taliban, you say, why should you negotiate? Because they're winning. They're advancing every single day. Why should they talk? And I think the simple answer is that the Taliban movement was founded as a reaction against chaos. I mean, if you look back in the history, in 1994, when the small T Taliban fronts, the local groups of mujahideen who called themselves Taliban, who were fighting against the Soviets, when those guys decided to get together and become the Taliban movement, you know, capital letter T, they were reacting against fragmentation. They were reacting against anarchy. And so if the Taliban want to continue to safeguard against fragmentation and against anarchy, then I think negotiations is a better path than trying to win militarily. Because even though the Taliban are doing very well militarily, if they try to redo the civil wars of the 1990s, it will be more chaos and more killing and more bloodshed. So In my humble way, I work for this very small peace NGO called the International Crisis Group. We talk to all sides. We try to tell them to negotiate. I don't know if they listen to us or not, but that's what we do. And I have to say, it's really exciting to be sitting here in 2019 and to see peace negotiations happening not too far from us here in Doha, because I would not have expected that even a year ago, 2 years ago. So it is getting harder and harder to predict what is going to happen next. And it makes my job as a conflict analyst much more difficult. Like Dr. Rubin said, there's a chance that we could end up with a bigger war. But I think it's good that it is unpredictable now, because the sort of predictable grinding increase in bloodshed that we've seen for years is a tragedy.
Thank you very much. Graham, you don't want to, unless you want to add something else, I will now give the floor to Ajmal.
Thank you, Aisha. Is this on? Perfect. Thank you to Brookings and colleagues for hosting the panel. I'll begin with a disclaimer. I'm here in my personal capacity, and my views are my own and not the position of the Government of Canada. I would also like, at the outset...
Can you guys hear him? Can you turn your
Okay.
his audio up a little bit? Thank you.
Yes. Is it better?
Okay.
I would also like to start at the outset to acknowledge the Afghan women who, along our sisters, mothers, daughters, who along with many Afghan children are the disproportionate survivors of the ensuing conflicts. And in spite of these challenges, their strength, sacrifices, and resilience, from the impoverished villages to the urban sprawls of the country, have sustained the Afghan people, whether within Afghanistan or beyond its borders. My focus is more on looking at the accountability for war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Afghanistan and the territory of Afghanistan, and how Afghanistan can balance its state obligations under the International Criminal Court. Afghanistan is a state party since May 2003, and how parties to the conflict can balance that state obligation. And now, as Dr. Rubin and Graham indicated, the history of the conflict in Afghanistan is fairly long, 4 decades almost. And there were crimes committed during the Soviet-Afghan War. There were crimes committed during the interfactional fightings and in the current phase of conflicts. So insofar as the past is concerned, there was no serious attempt in 1988 during the Geneva Accord talks between Soviets and the Afghan government and Pakistan to look at that issue. Subsequently, between the various factions of the Mujahideen, when they were doing various accords in Peshawar, in Rawalpindi, to form Mujahideen-led governments, there was no serious focus on these issues. And when the interim government was formed in Bonn in 2001, there was first attempt to look at the past and try to make it as a way to resolving various disputes and issues. Now, what makes the current negotiations a bit tricky for Afghanistan is that we have an independent court in The Hague. It has jurisdiction over crimes committed in the territory of Afghanistan or by Afghans. Many of you are aware the prosecutor requested the authorization to start investigations under their own statute. It was denied by the pretrial chamber. It is likely going to be appealed. And the question for negotiators is how to balance that aspect. When many of us in the human rights realm look at post-conflict countries and looking at transitional justice models. And some of the examples that I had covered and had gone to the field in Bosnia, Rwanda, and Sierra Leone, there are various models that are out there. And fortunately for Afghanistan, there is a body of research and jurisprudence that can inform negotiators in managing international crimes. The question is, would the various parties be able to address that? And if you can't ignore this area of and these issues because of the jurisdiction of the prosecutor. So one of the ways that the current government of Afghanistan had tried to look at these matters is through a transitional justice action plan that was launched in 2005. Unfortunately, it didn't materialize and it didn't have enough support to make matters more complicated. The agreement reached in 2001, for various reasons, co-opted various elements into the fragile Afghan democracy that had some serious past allegations against them. So they have been co-opted in the state system. And now if you're looking at the future state with a negotiated settlement, you can't start afresh because there is entrenched impunity in the country, economically, politically, in the security sector, and there are challenges. So it's a challenge in that respect for the Afghan government. Insofar as the alleged perpetrators are concerned, the law will follow them. There is no escaping. They can sit in Afghanistan as long as they want or in other safe havens. But as we know, in the UK, for instance, countries have extraterritorial jurisdiction over these crimes. So there was a commander back in the 90s who was arrested in the UK, charged for torture and held. There were cases in Netherlands involving former communist regime security officials. There are immigration laws that are used to deport and strip individuals who have committed crimes of their residency or citizenship. And then, we would have a scenario where if the court, the ICC, does start investigating and the prosecutor does get that authorization, there would be pending arrest warrants against individuals who are alleged to have committed crimes. And the question then becomes, who will be dealing with these officials, even if they are part of the government? So Afghanistan has some serious issues to address as part of the settlement and other parties to the conflict as well. Just a quick word on amnesties. Amnesties has been used in various conflicts. Afghanistan itself passed an amnesty law, and with the recognition that that would spur reconciliation and bring just to calm folks that are were in the government or are in the government, that they would not be prosecuted. These amnesties are fairly domestic. They don't have any relevance internationally, and they don't have any bearing over the ICC jurisdiction. So there are some serious questions that need to be addressed in that context.
Thank you very much, Ajmal. And just a request to the audio people, Ajmal is very soft-spoken, so when he's speaking, I mean, can you please balance his level with the rest of the people? So I'm going to start with a discussion, a couple of questions, and then we're going to bring you guys in. You can ask your question. Dr. Rubin, you mentioned about motivations and how if you don't get to the root of the problem, one war can lead to another war rather than peace and stability. So let's talk about the motivations of various actors in this particular war. And let's also start by also talking about who the actors really are. Do we know who the primary actors in today's scenario are? I mean, so we know US, we know Taliban, we know the Afghan government, we know Pakistan. Do we now consider China, Russia, and or Iran as major actors, or are they minor stakeholders? Who else is involved, and what does each of them at this point in time want or need for it to be a stable situation?
Well, I think it's useful to distinguish between those who are engaged in actual combat, those who may be supporting them one way or another, those who have stakes in the outcome and might have resources to affect it or make it more sustainable. At the moment, and I'll start, as an analyst of politics, international affairs, let's start with the Afghan state. So the Afghan state, as it now exists, is dependent on the United States and its allies for its funding, for the building and supplying of its security forces. The United States' original reason for going there was because it had been attacked, and it was part of this general strategy which went by the name of the War on Terror, and was, led to the war in Iraq and many other things, which hopefully we will not discuss here. And it was, interestingly enough, in 2001, when I was at the Bonn talks, there was a very broad sentiment and hope among Afghans that this crisis would bring peace to Afghanistan, because finally a big power was involved with enough resources and enough power to stabilize the country. And this was not even shared by some people in the Taliban leadership at the time. Because, remember what the Taliban did when they were in power was not necessarily fulfill all of their fondest dreams. They did what it was possible to do under very bad circumstances, and they didn't make the best choices under those circumstances either. But you can't criticize them for taking power by force rather than standing in elections, because there were no elections. It wasn't possible to have elections. So the United States' goal, however, if you actually work for the United States government, if you hear some question like, what is the goal of the United States, to start to laugh, perhaps. I remember I was once in a meeting in the Situation Room in the White House where we were talking about if it's possible to have a peace process with the Taliban or not. And there were some intelligence analysts who were saying, well, it's not really possible because the fundamental goal of the Taliban is to reestablish the Islamic Emirate. And I said, how do you know that? Anyway, I won't go into the whole, but basically they asked me, what do you think the fundamental goal of the Taliban is? So I said, well, what do you think the fundamental goal of the United States is? And of course they couldn't answer. Because the fact is, people's actions are not direct consequences of something called fundamental goals. There's no such thing. People act in circumstances. Now, in circumstances of conflict, we attribute motivations to our enemies in particular. Usually they're bad characteristics. They're extremists, they're imperialists, they're against Islam, they're against democracy, whatever. They describe their own actions as being a reaction to what their enemies are doing. They attacked us, through terrorism. They attacked us by invading our country for no reason, whatever. Ethnic issues. So I think that trying to define what are their fundamental interests, it's not a useful way of trying to solve a conflict. It's a kind of discourse which perpetuates the conflict. it's better to think what are their interests that they have in common, what are the interests that oppose them, and see what are misunderstandings, which can be very serious, that perhaps can be clarified through negotiate. And I don't mean a misunderstanding like, I thought you said you left the car over there, and no, it's actually over there. No. Serious non-understandings of people's motivations, intentions, resources, and so on. So, I really resist at analyzing for the reasons that I gave, analyzing the conflict in those terms. What's the interest of the United States? Donald Trump has a different idea of the interests of the United States, if he even has an idea, his feelings about it, which is different from the Obama administration, where I worked. But when I was in the Obama administration, different parts of the U.S. government had very different understandings of what interests of the United States were, depending on what their role and function was. So I would just say, again, this is what I started with. I wouldn't focus the analysis on the actors and their supposed motivations.
So then the question is, Graham, how do we analyze the situation? And if we're trying to move towards relative peace and stability in the region, how do we, as Dr. Rubin said, find those commonalities that can form some form of a basis?
I think Dr. Rubin is right that there are a lot of misunderstandings about the parties, and particularly about the Taliban. When I was in Kabul working for the United Nations, I was in some meetings where members of the Afghan government were telling very senior ambassadors, there's no such thing as the Taliban. There's just 20 different terrorist groups in Afghanistan, and we need to kill them all. And this was misinformation. This is not even a misunderstanding, because the people saying that knew exactly what they were doing. So I think the best way is not to guess, it's to test. And a good test that we had was in June of 2018. There was a 3-day ceasefire during the Eid holiday. And that ceasefire was essentially started by 3 press releases. The government of Afghanistan said that all of their forces would stop fighting. The US government said their forces would stop fighting. And the Taliban said their forces would stop fighting. And now, if you were one of those people, and there were some people, who believed that the government side of the war was just a collection of factions, that the different Tanzim, the Jumbushis, the Jamiatis, the Wadatis would never follow the instructions that came from the ARG, that came from the presidential palace, well, you were proven wrong on that day, because the guns went silent on the government side of the war. And if you were one of those people who was misinformed about the Taliban, and you thought that there was 20 different terrorist groups that are all running amok and doing their own thing in different parts of Afghanistan, no, the guns went silent. We have very good databases of violence across Afghanistan, and hundreds of incidents you normally would have seen, even during the quiet Eid period, nothing happened. Now, there were some ceasefire violations, there were some gunfights, but they were not primarily actually between the government and the Taliban. They involved the small local affiliate of ISIS in eastern Afghanistan and a couple other little things. But so, I agree that you can't just look at perceptions or theories about the conflict actors. You have to look at what they do concretely. And so the other piece of data that I would encourage you to look at is my former colleagues at the United Nations in Kabul spend a lot of time counting civilian casualties. They come here to Doha and they talk to the Taliban about it. They have very expensive offices all across Afghanistan that are trying to collect information about everything that goes bang in the country and whether or not civilians were killed. And that data is showing something really surprising for the very first time. It's showing that even as the conflict rises in intensity and the two sides are killing each other more and more, the number of civilians being killed in the conflict is actually going down for the first time. Now, it's early days. This is just a small amount of data for a short period of time, so we don't know whether the trend will continue or not. But that's something really amazing, that maybe fewer civilians overall are being killed. And part of it seems to be that the Taliban have taken a decision not to put bombs in cities and kill people in urban areas. And that's a major policy decision by the Taliban, and they haven't gotten any credit for it publicly. I think they probably should get credit for it because it's going to help with the negotiation process. But that's an example of the kind of step that can be taken, maybe not to have a ceasefire, but to at least de-escalate the conflict a little bit, to change the way the fighting is happening, to allow for peace negotiations to flourish.
I think in a recent meeting between Yamamoto and Taliban,
Yamamoto being the UN
Special Representative for Afghanistan and Taliban in Doha, because the Taliban's press department's very good. They put out statements before they come out of ARC sometimes, said that they were thanked for reducing the civilian casualties, because this year the civilian casualties from the government side are actually higher. Civilian casualties that the government's responsible for is higher than the ones that the Taliban are responsible for. So in a situation like this,
the UN has not publicly thanked the Taliban for reducing
the UN has not publicly thanked. The Taliban claim that the UN has thanked. So thank you for correcting me. So like I said, the Taliban press department's very active, and they've actively, promoted this. So in this situation, after we're talking about 18 years, Ajmal, 18 years of war, everybody's tired of war. We know from the 3 days of ceasefire that Graham talked about that even Taliban cadre who came to the cities and took selfies with citizens and had ice creams said that they were tired of war. But they also said that they had to listen to their emir and go back. If the emir said they had to fight, they had to fight. So that speaks to what you say about the command and control structure. But in that situation, when everybody wants to move beyond Ajmal, is accountability even possible? And I know you say the law follows, but please also tell me that in countries like this and in situations like this, when you start pushing for accountabilities of war crimes, human rights violations, violence perpetrated from both sides, does it help the process? Does it hurt the process? Does it even matter whether it helps or hurts?
Well, I think when states agreed to establish the International Criminal Court, there was a message that was sent by everyone that as humanity, we cannot, condone war crimes and crimes against humanity. That was done in part with what happened in Rwanda during the genocide, what happened in former Yugoslavia with the disintegration of that federation. And then you had the conflicts in Liberia, Sierra Leone, Kosovo, Indonesia. So there was a need to have a permanent treaty-based institution. At the time, the Afghan government, in fact, represented by current Chief Executive Officer of Afghanistan, Dr. Abdullah, he represented Afghanistan during the Rome negotiations in 1998 with an Afghan delegation. And they participated on behalf of the Afghan government. They endorsed the establishment of criminal court. And come 2003, Afghanistan deposited an instrument to be bound by the ICC. Now, that's where the legal aspect, insofar as the state obligation is concerned. What becomes a bit trickier for peace negotiations is that when different actors are involved, the United Nations cannot endorse a peace agreement that includes amnesties for war crimes. Other state parties to the ICC would laugh at that as well. So you're looking at a peace agreement that, yes, may include amnesties, but you would not have an international support for it. whether that amnesty is meant to co-opt various actors. And I think, in the latest example where you have a parallel jurisdiction of the ICC and a protracted conflict like Afghanistan is Colombia. So Colombia and the FARC rebels agreed to a peace treaty, and that brought in FARC to be part of and to be able to run for offices in Colombia. And under that agreement, they established a special tribunal. So, the peace treaty between FARC and the Colombian government did not include amnesties for war crimes. B, that special tribunal was tasked to investigate and provide accountability for those crimes. That was done to complement the ICC jurisdiction because Colombia is a state party to the ICC and it's under preliminary examination of the prosecutor. So that's a really interesting example that Afghanistan can look at and see how they could address the issue and not rock the boat too much, but at the same time recognize that there are no safe havens for war criminals, and that has to be stressed.
Okay. Yes, please.
Just a very brief comment. Every peace agreement has an amnesty in it. The only problems with amnesties for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Every peace agreement has an amnesty for acts of war, which are not the same as war crimes. Yeah. That is a distinction that is often lost. And of course, for any legal procedure, you must have to have fact-finding. After 4 decades of conflict, it's very hard to find any facts that people can agree on. And that is one of the reasons that transitional justice is not the same as criminal justice. And it is not primarily a process of putting people on trial and finding out who is guilty. It is also a process of memorializing what happened, of reconciliation, of reconstructive or justice, not just retributive justice. And the role of criminal proceedings and retributive justice in transitional justice is usually a relatively minor one. And the question about international criminal court is the danger that the country might lose sovereign control over its own peace process through an externally driven criminal procedure, which is not the same as transitional justice. The International Criminal Court is not established. It's not a court for transitional justice. Transitional justice is part of a transition. The International Criminal Court is for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And it's important to keep that distinction in mind.
Okay, let me open the floor for questions, and I'll take a couple of questions at a time, and I will write them down so I don't forget, who said what. So please, the gentleman. There is a mic. And if you'd please introduce yourself.
Okay. Let me first introduce my greetings to His Excellency Faizullah Kakkar, the Ambassador of Afghanistan.
Can you please hold the microphone closer?
Okay. You hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Let me first welcome and introduce my greetings to His Excellency Professor Faizullah Kakkar, Ambassador of Afghanistan, my friend. Second, I was going, Aisha, to speak about Loya Gerja, which is presided by Sayyaf. The
Loya Jirga that's
Loya Jirga in Afghanistan now, yesterday. About appearance of Baghdadi, about reconciliation, ongoing reconciliation here by Zalmay Khalilzada. But Dr. Agmal shocked me when he said that Afghanistan is the poorest country in the world. This is not true. Maybe Afghanistan in the living standard is poor, but Afghanistan is the richest country with its resources. Gemstones, petrol and gas, fertile land, water, all this. But Afghanistan has 2 million mines left in her fertile land by conflicts between superpowers. 2 million martyrs were dead in conflict in these poor people. So Afghanistan, I say to the superpowers, pull your forces of Afghanistan and leave them in peace. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Go ahead, please.
My name is Abdul Waris. I'm from Doha Institute. My question is to the panel. First question that how long will the U.S. Keep the main stakeholder Afghanistan's regime away from...
How long will the U.S.
Speak a little slower and more clearly,
Okay.
please.
How long will the U.S. Keep the main stakeholder, which is the Afghan regime, out of the direct peace talks between Taliban and the U.S.? And the second question to Dr. Graham Smith is that don't you think that the recent consensus made by Russia, China, and the U.S. For supporting the peace process of between Taliban and the U.S. is due to the danger of ISIS, despite being declared as defeated, like choosing between bad and worse, they are going to choose the bad ones. Thank you.
So I think what the gentleman is asking is how long will the U.S. keep the main stakeholder, the Afghan government, out of these negotiations? For those of you who don't know this, the negotiations are continuing between a U.S. team led by Zalmay Khalilzad and a Taliban delegation led by Mullah Baradar or Stanigzai, his nominated chief negotiator. The Afghan government is out of the negotiation. The Taliban insist that they will not talk to the Afghan government. They call it a puppet regime with nothing in its hands, and they divide the Afghan peace process in two parts. In the first part, they talk to the foreign occupiers, in their words, which in their words are the main cause of the problem. And once the foreign occupiers announce a withdrawal timeline, then they sit with the Afghan stakeholders and decide about the future of Afghanistan. But back to the question, how long can we keep the Afghan government out of this, Dr. Rubin?
Well, first of all, I just point, the acoustics in this room are very poor because all of the walls are flat. And that means that there are multiple echoes of whatever you say. Therefore, please speak very slowly and distinctly because I could not understand a lot of what people were saying for that reason, okay? So now, the answer to that, first of all, look, the United States is not keeping the Afghan government out of the talks. The position of the Taliban, and let me be precise, because people misstate this, and diplomacy is complex, even by the Taliban, and depends on the precise meaning of words. It's not about general attitudes. The Taliban position is that they want to first talk to the United States because the United States overthrew them, charged them with supporting terrorism, and the United States controls the decisions that they are most concerned about, namely the withdrawal of its troops. The Afghan government has no control over the withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan. Taliban don't, of course they call the Afghan government slaves. I don't know, they would call them, ghulaman and so on, slaves of the occupiers and so on. But they didn't say that's why they're not talking to them. They said they're not talking to them because as long as the American troops are there, there's no level playing field and the Afghan government cannot decide things for itself. The Taliban also take the position that once there, and this is a little vague, as often happens in diplomacy, that once there is an agreement about withdrawal, and implemented or not, unclear, then they will talk to the Afghan government, though without recognizing it initially as the legitimate government of Afghanistan. So there is a sequence. From the point of view of the United States does not have the option of including the Afghan government in these talks, because if they do, the Taliban, at this point, the Taliban will leave and there will be no talks. So from the US point of view, there was a choice between no talks and talks with only the Taliban. And for a long time, we said we chose no talks for various reasons having to do with what's going on the ground in Afghanistan and what's going on in the United States. The United States changed its position. But it is also the position that whatever is agreed between the United States and the Taliban over those issues, it will not be implemented until there is also an agreement among Afghans, the Taliban, the Afghan government, and other Afghans, about the political future of Afghanistan. So a peace process is not just one set of talks. Peace processes have multiple tracks that are interrelated to each other. And what is happening now in Doha is just the start of a process which will involve U.S. and the Taliban, Afghans, Pakistan, Iran, Russia, China, United Nations organization, et cetera, many other things. And so as Ambassador Khalilzad has said, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. That's how it works in negotiations. You might agree on one paragraph, but you don't implement that paragraph if the rest of the agreement isn't agreed to. So even if so it's a big picture. I think people don't appreciate that. Of course, it can be disrupted at any time as well. But what I'm saying is, what is the position, as I understand it, of the U.S. government at present. But you know, we have to make a distinction these days sometimes between the United States government and President Trump, who has his own ideas, which may be different from other parts of. So he might intervene, you know, as he did in Libya last week, and suddenly change the policy. I can't predict that.
Graham, why don't you take the second part, which is about Daesh and about the trilateral agreement being Daesh-centric?
Yeah, I'm really glad that has been highlighted. I think Dr. Rubin highlighted it, and it's good that you highlighted it. One of the things that you heard in that statement was these three major powers welcoming the Taliban fight against Daesh or ISIS or Islamic State Khorasan province, they call it in eastern Afghanistan. I think it's an important symbolic thing because it means that you have the United States, Russia, China, the Afghan government, and the Taliban all agreeing that we need to fight these guys. But I have to say it is mostly symbolic because Daesh in eastern Afghanistan has maybe 4 or 5 districts amongst the 400 or so districts in the country. And of the, you know, roughly 22,000 violent incidents that occur each year in Afghanistan, about 2% can be linked somehow to foreign fighters like Daesh. So yeah, it's a thing, but it's a very small thing.
Ajmal, okay, I'll take another question and I'll add mine to it. Go ahead. Please hand the mic to that gentleman.
This question's for Graham, because of your interactions with him. So with the counterterrorism agreements that are part of the negotiations, I want to know if you think the Taliban are capable of executing that kind of centralized control of tens of thousands of fighters spread across rural Afghanistan, reserve forces in Pakistan. From what you've seen, do they have the capability to execute that kind of control over tens of thousands of fighters and keep them from conducting attacks that would violate the agreement?
Is there any other related question? Anyone, any other related question to that, and then we can move to another category? So Graham, do you think
the short answer is yes. Yes, they do have that capability. I don't think you have to take their word for it. I think you can look at, for example, what happened last summer. Alice Wells was having conversations with the Taliban about.
Explain who Alice Wells.
Oh, I'm sorry. The American envoy was having conversations with the Taliban about counterterrorism. And you know what's interesting is I think the Taliban have the same skepticism about the Americans that the Americans have about the Taliban, because the Taliban were not really sure if they could trust the American commitment to fight ISIS. So there was mistrust on both sides of the table. And the Taliban proposed, hey, look, let's test and see if we can trust each other on this. We'll do a major offensive against the small, self-declared ISIS affiliate in northern Afghanistan, and you guys keep your bombers out of the sky and don't hit us while we're doing it. And the Americans said yes. And the Taliban did mobilize hundreds of men to go kill those guys who had black flags in the northern part of Afghanistan. And they were doing very well militarily. They were just about to wipe them out when helicopters came and rescued those that small band of guys under a guy named Kari Hekmat. And so that was a setback. I think there's a lot of room for cooperation. Yeah, I think definitely the organization has that capability, and you know, we can talk more after the session if you like, but you know, there was some very major fighting that happened, for example, in Zabul province in November of 2015, where the Taliban fought hundreds and hundreds of guys who disagreed with them about the nature of jihad, who were extremists, basically. And so, very major bloody battles have happened on exactly this topic.
Can I just add one thing? You asked also about their reserve forces in Pakistan. Of course, the Taliban, I believe, have less control over their reserve forces in Pakistan than they do over their forces in Afghanistan, because those forces are more subject to open interference by the Pakistani intelligence agency. So if we are serious about enforcing a ceasefire and counterterrorism for the entire conflict, we must have the cooperation of Pakistan to implement it, or it will not work.
Dr. Levin? Go ahead. Can we get the mic, please?
Thanks a lot. Anatol Levin from Georgetown University in Qatar. I'd like to ask Dr. Rubin and the panel, from my perspective, an agreement between the United States and the Taliban on the issues between them is perhaps not so very complicated now. I must confess that I have much more difficulty imagining the contours of a political settlement between the present Afghan state, or the Kabul state, and the Taliban, and power sharing between them. And I wondered if members of the panel could tell us some of their ideas of what that might be and how it might work. Thank you.
Does anybody have a related question? Or if not, I can, yeah, go ahead, please.
Hi, Sarah Maiwandazimi. How are you, Graham?
Can you hold the mic closer? Thank you.
My question is, the international community continues to reaffirm its commitment to support the current government every year. But in the last 10 years, we've seen a steep decline in international financing. We're experiencing extreme donor fatigue. My question is if you feel that the agreement will result in a reinvigorated appetite for international financing for the current government.
Okay. So let's deal with the issue that Dr. Anatol Levin raised first, which is about the intra-Afghan thing. There is a lawyer jirga going on that started yesterday. It was a government initiative, not controlled by government, about 3,200 delegates in Afghanistan, but even that was controversial. 12 presidential candidates boycotted it, including former President Hamid Karzai, calling it election campaigning by President Ghani. So this whole idea about the intra-Afghan, how do you see that, Dr. Rubin? Is it more complicated?
Well, first of all, only someone who has never been involved in talks between the United States and the Taliban could say that they're relatively simple.
Comparative.
Look, fortunately, here's another snide remark I'm going to make. Fortunately, political developments are not limited by the scope of our imagination. And I think our imaginations are extremely poor. And that's why we can't imagine things that we're going to go on. Because there isn't going to be any formal power sharing agreement. There's not one now. There's going to be an agreement about certain issues like release of prisoners, participation in a constitutional process by the Taliban, so there's a constitution that they're not forced to accept at the point of a gun. And then, just like there is now, there will be informal arrangements. How does power sharing exist in Afghanistan right now? People are appointed to be governors from different factions. They have some power as governors, but they also have powers through their informal power networks. They have some funds from the government budget. They have some funds from other sources that we might call corruption. Sometimes it's more clearly corruption, sometimes less clearly so. So the only way, and furthermore, it will not, the future of a political settlement does not mean the end of political conflict. It does not mean settling all the political and social issues of Afghanistan. People say it's impossible to settle all those things, so peace is not possible. They are right, it's impossible to settle all those things. But perhaps it is possible to agree to continue very intense and bitter conflicts over those things through non-military means. And the key to doing that lies not just with the Afghans, or maybe not primarily with the Afghans, but with those who provide them with the resources to finance and carry out and use military means to carry out those political disputes.
Graham, I want to also add something here, which is maybe you can expand on what Dr. Rubin said. Right now, Afghanistan is going through an election year, September 28th presidential election coming up. On one hand, we're talking about negotiation with Taliban who do not recognize the Afghan constitution, and widespread belief is that whatever final agreement is, there will be changes to constitution. May or may not happen, but that's the widespread belief. So does it help that Afghanistan continues on its path of democracy by holding presidential elections, slightly delayed but still, or hurt the process that while you're negotiating with a group that doesn't recognize the constitution, you're installing a government that feels entitled to another 5 years of power?
Look, may I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. There may come a point in the negotiations where there will be a clear choice between, on the one hand, say having a ceasefire and a political settlement, and on the other hand, holding the elections. We are not at that point. We are not near to a ceasefire or a political settlement, and I might add, we are not near to holding elections either. Just announcing a date for elections does not make them happen. If you don't control the territory and population, you don't have the financing, and your electoral commission is a hot mess. So I hope that the peace talks advance to the point where there actually is a dilemma, where perhaps right now postponing the elections or announcing you're not going to have elections would not solve anything. It would just weaken the government. I hope we get to the point where it might solve something and we can think about it seriously and its costs and benefits.
So I want to bring both Graham, you and Ajmal in on this point. You said something about weakening the government, and there was a question about Afghan political elite. And yes, we will get to your question about international community after this. The Afghan elite seems very divided. It seems like the opposition is hell-bent on weakening the government, insisting that President Ghani step down after May 22nd, and there's an interim government. May 22nd is constitutionally when his term comes to an end. The Afghan Supreme Court has extended it till whenever the next election is held. So, Graham, the Afghan political elite, does it even matter in this whole process?
Sure, yeah, because anyone, who has the capability of starting a new multi-factional civil war, we have to pay attention to them. And, the same people who were involved in the civil wars of the 1990s, now a lot of them are billionaires with a lot more guns than they had before. So, sure, they are an important voice in the room. Whether or not they're able to remove President Ghani on the 23rd of May, I'm a little bit skeptical personally. But there will be very strong calls from major opposition figures for President Ghani to step down, and that will increase the pressure on him. I think it's worth not forgetting about Sarah's question about the money.
Mm-hmm. Please go ahead.
If you don't mind, because I'm really happy that the World Bank is doing work right now on trying to imagine sort of a post-peace deal financing situation. And you're right, Dr. Rubin, we shouldn't be limited by our imaginations, but once in a while we can exercise them to try to look over the horizon. And it really matters the kind of pot of gold that exists at the end of the rainbow, because if I'm the Taliban and I'm trying to imagine, like, do I want to bother with preserving state institutions, or whether or not there's money for the salaries to pay people in government offices matters a lot. And so I really hope that the international community will stay engaged, and that money can be part of the solution rather than, frankly speaking, as it's been since 2001, part of the problem.
So what can the international community do? Because one of the biggest fears I see in Afghanistan when I travel, from province to province is they think that if the boots on the ground leave, so will the money. And they fear that the international attention span is usually very short, so 3 to 4 years after the foreign troops withdraw, they will forget that there was a country called Afghanistan, and the aid money will start, it'll slow down to a trickle, and Afghanistan will fall into chaos. So what can the international community do?
Well, first, the fact that the international community is kind of a vague term. It includes both the United States, Pakistan, and Iran, for instance, which will not behave all in the same way. But the fact that the United States will lose interest in Afghanistan is a fact, and it's kind of surprising that the United States has remained engaged in Afghanistan for as long as it has. But it's just a fact that can only be marginally affected by political action, that the United States' involvement in Afghanistan is going down. And that is why I advise my Afghan friends, who sometimes feel that after I tell them this, they're not my friends anymore, that they have to plan for a future when they are stuck living with their neighbors and their own economy, and not with the United States. And that may come sooner rather than later. Now, we may argue, however, there are planning exercises going on to try to assure that assistance is extended even after a peace agreement. It is also true that most of the expenses in Afghanistan have been for military operations, which will not be needed anymore after peace. But it's also true that they come from different budgets. So it is true that when the troops leave, the amount of aid will go down. It may also be that the amount of aid needed will be less. But I'm confident there will be a crisis or a continuing problem of insufficient assistance. And that is something we have to understand and plan for and work for. We can perhaps reduce it, but we can't eliminate it.
Ajmal, I want to bring you in on the human rights issue. The other, of course, big concern we hear far and wide in Afghanistan is eroding of women's rights, minority rights, human rights. I was recently in Kabul talking to artists, painters, filmmakers, who were not sure what a future Afghanistan will look like, but on the other side, they grew up in an Afghanistan, at least half of Afghan population is young. Many of them grew up in a post-Taliban Afghanistan. By post-Taliban, I mean after the Taliban lost power in Kabul. So, they've become filmmakers, they've become actors, they've become painters. How do you see, Ajmal, that part? Do you think the Taliban will come to terms with this new, younger Afghanistan?
Well, I think the human rights side of the equation, you have a state right now, as fragile and as disjointed it may be, there is a constitution. There is some semblance of a rule of law. You have some authority, as corrupt that institution may be, whether it's police or the judiciary. The rights are there to be protected, and then there is the lens of international community as well. So it's not unique challenge to Afghanistan. It's in many post-conflict countries you find that challenge, and it's the ability of the Afghan people themselves to reconcile with their new realities. Whether we would see a situation where the barrel of a gun will be used to force someone to have a beard, I don't think we will regress down that road, because individual choice and the Islamic principles are fairly clear on those aspects. So I think there would be varying degree of regression of rights, which is the case even now. There is urban-rural expectations of the country as well. So it's going to be an ongoing challenge as Afghanistan stands up on its feet. There are economic factors. Thousands of Afghan youth have left the country. They continue to leave through smuggling routes, try to reach Europe for a new economic, life, and that's not unique to them. Look at Iraq, look at Syria. So, insecurity, the lack of access to education, these are various aspects that are related to broader human rights issues. And I think, we should take pride in the fact that the Afghan women are part, are playing fairly significant role. And I think that goes back to their resilience. Thank you.
Okay. Look, there is a confusion about this issue because there are two things that people get mixed up. There are two different dangers to the gains that some Afghans have made over the past few years. And one is that the Taliban might come to power and reverse them by force. Now, by the way, a political settlement is not an arrangement by which the opposition comes to power and enforces all its policies. So that would not be the result of a political settlement. That would be the result of the failure of a political settlement. Second, and I believe this is a greater danger, the funding that supports all of those activities could erode and disappear. That's a much greater danger. It is not true that all these protections for human rights and education and healthcare and so on is very well established and institutionalized in Afghanistan now, so that as long as the Taliban keep their hands off of them, they will continue. No. Those things are paid for almost entirely by international aid. And if the aid doesn't come, those things won't be there, whether the Taliban or any other Afghans want to support them or destroy them. And what I'm afraid of is a situation where those benefits and protections start to erode, primarily because we're not supporting them. And then we use that as a rationale to decrease our support because there's inadequate protection for human rights in Afghanistan.
Any other questions? Go ahead, please. Where's the mic? Yeah.
Good evening. Thank you for being here and welcome to Doha. So, there are 2 points. One, Graham, Dr. Rubin, and everyone really highlighted all the different parties fighting. But no one has highlighted the fact that the Afghan people are fighting with their lives. Do the Afghan people really matter to the United States, or to Pakistan, or to the regional countries? Or are they really after their own interests? That's something that's coming from the Afghan people. The other point is, with all due respect to the panelists, I see an opposition of the government sitting here on the table, saying the government is doing X, Y, and Z wrong, but the Taliban should get credit for the fact that they have stopped killing people in cities. Do you want to give them credit for that, or do you want to ask Ajmal to come up with some sort of justice code there? And then the fact that Aisha mentioned that the Taliban are really good with their press statements. They're not good. They have confirmed the death of their leader after 6 years. So probably we need to really look at that as well. Just your thoughts on that.
Okay, so are you guys bashing the government? And why? Why do Taliban get credit when they do a little bit after having killed so many people?
Well, look, any time that an armed actor changes its behavior and hundreds of people are alive today as a result, yeah, maybe we should recognize that fact. And I'm actually curious about why that fact has not been recognized at all. And maybe we need to be thinking about ways of discussing, the future of the country that includes all of the people who are in the country. In the last elections, the IEC claimed that 3.6 million Afghans voted. Only probably 1.5 million were able to be confirmed through biometrics. But anyways, let's say 3.6 million people voted. So latest satellite estimate, 38 million Afghans. That means you have an incredibly low turnout. You know, amongst all of the 200 parliamentary democracies that are rated by people who look at these things, that's the very bottom. That puts Afghanistan in the realm of like Haiti and Cote d'Ivoire and Kuwait. And so, you know, like maybe the voices of Afghans should matter in the political system. There needs to be a system that includes the Taliban so that you can have elections where people, you know, vote and the opinions of ordinary people are included in the voting.
Look, politics is not humanitarianism. When I went to the Bonn talks as an advisor to Special Representative Lakhdar Brahimi, I had all kinds of ideas about how these meetings among Afghan groups might address the problems of Afghanistan. But all they were really interested in was who would get into power. Okay. And I'm not blaming Afghans for that because the internationals are the same. That is how it works. That is how things get done. That's how politics work. How to bring, now that doesn't mean they're not concerned about the people. It's a complex interaction. But, you know, in politics, the search for power, because you can't even do anything, even if your goal is to do something for people, you can't do it unless you have power. You don't get power by expressing, you know, good wishes. And often the means that you have to use to get power undermine whatever good intentions you may have had to begin with. And I'm sure I don't need to give you any examples for you to understand that. So, you know, it is true that political actors are hypocritical and dishonest, but I don't think that is something that deserves news coverage.
I see more hands and I have a lot more questions. However, our time today is up. However, for anybody who has more questions, we do have a cocktail reception afterwards. So you're welcome to join us and you can ask the panelists more questions. I know that I'm going to be asking them more questions. But thank you very much for coming here. Like I said, let me reiterate, as we sit here, not far from here, I don't know exactly which hotel, but not far from here, Zalmay Khalilzad, the chief US negotiator, is talking with Taliban. After 18 years of war, almost everybody wants peace. Let's hope that with all the complications and the complex scenarios and nuances that our panelists explained, the peace that finds Afghanistan is a lasting peace and it does not turn into another war. After 40 years, the country's had enough and it's a beautiful country and it'll be a pleasure to visit it when we don't have to worry about, you know, landmines or IEDs or rocket launchers, and, you know, we can actually drive from one end to Afghanistan to the other. On that note, I thank my panelists, Dr. Barnett Rubin, Graham Smith, Ajmal Pashtunyar, for coming here from various parts of the world, and I thank all of you for joining Brookings Doha Center, and I hope I'll see some of you in the cocktail reception.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.